Well, semiconductor players, big and small, are scrambling for a piece of that federal CHIPS Act funding that just opened up this week. But who will be the big winners and losers when it comes to chip making? Here to talk all things chips is Bernstein Research Managing Director Stacy Rasgon. Thank you for joining me this morning, Stacy. So let's first talk about some of the of course. Now, let's talk about some of these winners and losers here, especially when you factor in some of these strings attached, especially for those receiving at least $150 million of funding.
Yeah, no, you bet. So there are some strings attached, and they mentioned a few. The buyback one is kind of interesting. It doesn't say you can't buy back stock, but it kind of says we would really prefer it if you wouldn't buy back stock if you're getting funding. And that does have implications. I'll give you one example. Texas Instruments, for example, is building an absolute ton of capacity here in the U.S. Texas Instruments also buys back a lot of stock. Their general capital allocation strategy is to return 100% of their free cash flow net of debt repayment through dividends and buybacks. And so you could ask yourself, if TI, can't buy back stock to get this money, will they take the money? I don't know. TI doesn't actually need it. They're going to do what they're going to do regardless. On the other hand, you have a company like Intel, who is going to be one of the large beneficiaries of this. And in fact, you could argue that the CHIPS Act itself was sort of created in some sense to help them give a bolster to U.S. Leading edge semiconductor manufacturing. Intel stopped buying back stock, 5 or 6 quarters ago, and they just cut their dividend. They don't have the cash flow to do it anyway, so I guess it won't be a problem for them. They will be taking some of this money. But given some of the strings that are on this, some semiconductor companies are going to have to think, how important is it to get this funding? Do we need it or not? And, what are the trade-offs that we're going to have to make? It's not exactly cut and dry.
And as we look at some of these issues surrounding this, obviously we're seeing this act mostly focuses on production. The US already has, design covered. But what about the rest of the supply chain? You have the assembly, packaging, the testing market for semiconductors, also very important, still dominated by China and Taiwan. How far do you think this funding is really going to be in making the US more competitive when you factor in the other parts of the supply chain as well?
Well, let's step back. You could ask yourself, is this going to make the U.S. more competitive just in general? I'm not convinced that it will. You have to remember, the amounts that we're talking about here, they seem very large, but they're in fact a rounding error in terms of the amount of money that is really required. If the goal of this CHIPS Act is to really structurally increase the percentage of capacity that's installed in the U.S. versus worldwide, my guess is that percentage is not going to change very much with these kinds of numbers. The goal with these is to offset some of the cost differentials and actually get the stuff started here in the U.S. I think on the hope that over time you'll build more around it. So just a level set there. In terms of some of the other areas of the supply chain, though, you're right, packaging and everything, which is actually also, I believe, included and covered under this as well. Intel, I'll just go back to them. They're actually building a fairly sizable advanced packaging plant. I believe it's in New Mexico. And it's going to be $3 billion, I think, they're going to spend on that. And presumably that is something where they'll be able to apply for funding as well. The bulk of this probably will, I think, go toward wafer manufacturing, but there are other parts of the supply chain that this can apply to as well.
So let's talk about some of these specific chip makers. I mean, you mentioned Intel. Been struggling year to date versus, say, Nvidia, which has pretty much been just off to the races. So as you look at what's happening within the semis right now, and as you mentioned, Intel's supposed to be the biggest beneficiary of this CHIPS Act. Why do you think we're still seeing a disconnect? How much of that is an Intel issue versus sort of waiting for some of these benefits of the CHIPS Act to kick in?
It's because Intel's business is horrendous right now. Their revenues have collapsed. Their margins have collapsed. They've got a 3 in front of their gross margins. The last time that happened, I was in elementary school. It was in the 80s. They're burning absolute tons of cash. They're firing people. They're scrambling to cut costs. And in the meantime, they're still losing share in their key markets. And so there's a lot of the Intel issues that are Intel specific. They just cut their dividend. Again, they don't have the cash flow to support it anymore. Nvidia, in contrast, to be fair, they already had to cut their numbers pretty sizably last year as the cryptocurrency market kind of imploded. That impacted some of their businesses. The thing about Nvidia is their primary businesses are probably at a bottom now. We're in front of 2 product cycles, one in gaming as well as one in data center. They've kind of suggested, especially on the data center side, that it's going to be accelerating through the year. And they're on top of that, now there's just a ton of interest in things like generative AI, and I'm sure lots of your viewers here have played with ChatGPT and all this stuff. That goes right to benefiting them. And these opportunities, if you sit down and think about how big they could be over the long term for a company like Nvidia, they are very, very sizable potentially, and that's why they're getting the multiple and the stock performance that they are, as opposed to an Intel, which is structurally and secularly challenged and has had pretty sizable execution issues over the last couple of years.
And of course, we have to talk generative AI. You mentioned it there. And you highlight one of the companies that's really not getting as much shine as the others, which is Broadcom. Yeah. Why do you think people aren't focusing on them?
Well, I mean, when you think about like the AI winners and losers, if we want to go there, Broadcom doesn't necessarily come to top line. People think about compute and everything. The thing is, though, there's a lot of compute in these generative AI applications, and you have to put a lot of these things together. It requires a lot of networking. And Broadcom is benefiting on that front. They do networking chips. The other thing that Broadcom does that maybe like some people may not be aware is, there's lots of these like hyperscalers that are starting to build their own AI chips. Broadcom has a chip design business. They actually are doing the design work for most of those projects as well. And so they called out a fair amount. I think if you added up, it was something like $1.6 billion in incremental growth across their switching, their networking chips, as well as these chip design services year over year into fiscal 23, it came recently just from the generative AI opportunities, which is a really sizable. I mean, it would by itself, that would drive their networking business up probably high teens, 18, 19% year over year, even if the rest of it didn't grow. So they are actually a pretty significant potential beneficiary, not from the compute side necessarily, although some on the chip design, but also on the networking side. Not as much like top of mind for folks, and yet Broadcom is very, very cheap. And we did a note this morning. They reported earnings last night, and the title of the note was sort of like an AI story at a smartphone price, and that's kind of what you're getting right now. So I'm actually really liking that Broadcom story.
Well, certainly opportunities to be found there. As you see there, Broadcom flying under the radar, but maybe it shouldn't be. Stacy, thank you so much for joining me this morning, and have a great weekend.